But let me move to the second part, which is brand new. So everything that I showed you before, I have given other versions of that talk, although updated every year, to other groups. But this is the first time, other than just the MFA graduation, which was a week ago, where I've addressed a class about to start work for the first time. And so this is why I decided to have completely bespoke slides called How to Make a Successful Start to Your Career, trying to help you hit the ground running. And as I delivered, or as I prepared these slides, it was actually somewhat emotional for me to do this, because I looked back at all of the mentors that I've been lucky to have over my past career, and I thought to myself, what did I learn from him, what did I learn from her? And writing all of that down is what I hope to try to convey to you today. And in addition to my direct mentors who I worked for, I also crowdsourced some of this from my friends who were peers of me at university, or my former students. So a lot of the material here, if you like this is not down to me, this is down to a lot of people who've helped me write this. And so what I have here is 6 points, and these points will obviously be interconnected in some way. So the first point that I have is curiosity. So what you have in a couple of days' time is you have graduation here at LBS. So graduation, if you were in an American school, that's called commencement. And commencement might seem to be like a weird name because commencement means the beginning, so why is this the name of the end of your time at LBS? Well, while commencement is the end of your time at LBS, it's the start of the rest of your career as LBS alumni. And I think this is important because while here under the IMIM, you've had hopefully a fantastic education, your education does not stop at LBS graduation. Your education should continue afterwards. You should look at your first job and all subsequent jobs by thinking of these as learning opportunities and maximizing what you can learn from every situation. So a level 1 activity is once you're given a job, just to do that job well, to execute it. But a much higher level of activity is not just to do it well, but think about why you're doing it and what is the maximum that you can possibly learn. So the first mentor that I'm going to refer to is a guy called Sir Simon Roby, who was the global head of investment banking at Morgan Stanley. He now has his own boutique, Roby Warshaw, which is extremely successful. And he had the 7 C's of investment banking, of which the number 1 thing that he thought was the most important out of any analyst was curiosity. So what did he mean by this? He meant by this by just having an attitude of trying to maximize learning, of always trying to think about what can you take away from every particular situation or every particular task. Let me give you a concrete example. So when I was a first-year analyst, I was asked to do a comparable companies analysis where you would take your company that you're analyzing and then a mix of 14 comparables. And then the managing director said to me, can you just redo the analysis adding Monsanto, another comparables company, to that? And I said to him, I actually don't think this would be a good idea. Right, because if I was to add this 15th comparable company, I'd have to change these stock price charts, I'd have to change all these valuations because all of these things feed through, and we already had 14 comparable companies. Is the analysis going to change just by adding 1 to the peer group? And the managing director was actually quite impressed by this, and he said, oh, actually, you're right. Sorry, I didn't understand how much this would cause you to have to redo all the analysis. And you make a good point that we already have enough comparable companies. No need to do that. So why was that a good response? Well, first, it saved me yet another all-nighter just going through all of this analysis. But more importantly, it recognized that what I was doing is not just passively executing what he asked me to do. Well, on the one hand, you might think that the ideal analyst is just somebody who does what they're told to and does it well and correctly. But it was trying to develop sort of the associate level skills as to what would the client want. Is the client's view going to be any different, seeing 15 comparable companies rather than 14 comparable companies? And my boss at the time just agreed that it wasn't, so we just kept the analysis as it is. Another person I'm going to quote from is a guy called Ryan Marshall, who was the global head of fixed income research when I moved into the sales and trading side. And he said, always be long options. So what he meant by this is something I alluded to earlier when we think about the 100-year life, is that we might have many different careers over our lifetime, so you'd always like to be in careers that give you the maximum flexibility going forwards. And he talked about this in the idea of sales, trading, and research on a fixed income trading floor. So it's very rare for somebody to start in trading and move to sales or research, but most people who start in research could later move into sales or trading. So even if your ultimate goal might be to end up in trading, he said the best thing to do was to start off in research so that you truly understand the product that you're about to trade. And now Ryan talked about this in the idea of choosing your career, choosing where to start. So the position that you should be in should be a position that allows you to learn, which allows you to be long options. But I'm talking to you about this in terms of the attitude. So the ability to learn is not only about what position that you end up being in, but the attitude towards that position. And another example from my prior time was that in my first year, I was allocated to be in the chemicals division of Morgan Stanley, advising chemicals clients. And to be honest, I was really disappointed with this, because to me, the chemicals industry wasn't so interesting. Right, the boss of that division had a chemical engineering degree from Cambridge. The other analyst joining with me did natural sciences at Cambridge. They cared about surfactants or what the difference was between alkyd resins and epoxy resins. I didn't care about that difference. I wanted to be in something else, like financial institutions, where the drivers were interest rates and stuff that I had learned at university. And so I went into that, and I was really disappointed to begin with, but I thought, well, let me try and learn as possible from this. One of the other disappointments about chemicals is there was a very small team. So there was just the 2 first-year analysts, the managing director, and the vice president. And because of that, we would never be able to do any execution. Right, there's 2 parts to a deal. You pitch for the business, and then you do the live deal. And what's really exciting for a bank is to work on a live deal and see that go to the front page of the Financial Times. And I knew that because this group was so small, they never executed any of their deals. Right, they just won the business, and then they outsourced it to the M&A department to be executed. So I knew that I'd go through my entire first year not doing a single deal, maybe just doing pie charts of sales by product or something like that. But the flip side to working in such a small team was that I didn't have any associate. Right, normally you've got massive hierarchy with like maybe 5 different levels. With me and the fellow first-year analysts, there was just the VP and the MD and nobody in between. And so what that meant was that there was once where I went to New York to give a presentation to a client, which normally analysts don't do. And that I worked really hard at, gave a good presentation. And then on the basis of that, they invited me to the next meeting, which was going to be in Q8 in front of the global head of investment banking. And this is something I would have never had the chance to had I started in a large team. So while I certainly didn't learn anything in terms of execution, because I never worked on a live deal, this gave me the chance to learn something else, to work with senior bankers directly, to work in some of the softer skills, such as presentation skills, even though I might not have been working on the modeling skills you might get in a live deal. And that was something which I was able to learn, even though initially I thought that this was something which might be quite disappointing. So you will all know the story of David and Goliath, and I know that initially this was known in a religious context, but this was made into a secular story, most particular in the book by Malcolm Gladwell. And what Malcolm Gladwell talks about is the idea that David killing Goliath is not as much as an upset as people thought. Because before David killed Goliath, he killed a lion and a bear. And he did this when he was working as a shepherd looking after sheep. Now, working as a shepherd is really boring. You don't talk to any other humans during your days. But he took this seriously, and that, on the mountainside, in the boring place, in the lonely place, in the quiet place, is how he learnt to kill Goliath. And similarly, you might think in your first job you might be on the mountainside. Like I thought I was in chemicals, I was put to the wilderness. But it's in the lonely place, and it's the boring place, and it's in the quiet place that you acquire the skills to become excellent bankers or consultants or marketers or whatever you want to be later in the future. And again, this just depends on an attitude. It was so tempting for me, and I did this for a few weeks, just to sulk that I was being put into chemicals and not realize what the massive learning opportunity there was from that. I was at a talk by Simon Sinek last month, so some of you will know he's given the third most famous TED Talk of all time called Why Great Leaders Inspire. And he talked about this idea of finding a fulfilling job. And people talk about finding a fulfilling job in terms of like you find it under a rock. Right? If you turn over enough rocks, then you'll suddenly find a rock with a gem underneath it. But he says this is not the case. He talked about what I've called creative exploration. Right? Exploring and being curious is not just about seeing what's there, but actually affecting what's there potentially through your attitude. So you don't find a fulfilling job, you find a job that could be fulfilling, and you make it fulfilling by deciding to take everything as an opportunity to learn. The final point here in terms of an opportunity to learn is to actively seek feedback from other people and take all feedback seriously. So when I moved into the trading floor, the first thing we had to do was like a mock presentation to the head of your team, who pretended to be a client. I had to give a presentation about forward rates, and at the end I got the feedback that the presentation style they didn't like. And I was quite upset about this because I'd done a lot of work at public speaking and debating in my prior life, so I thought this seems to be a bit off in terms of the feedback. But after initially being put off, I thought, okay, well, let me try and take this feedback seriously and try to work on the specific areas they want me to improve. And then at the end of the summer associate internship, there was a real client dinner where you had to pitch a deal, a trade to a hedge fund client, and that I was able to do a very solid job on that, having taken the feedback into account. So often you might see this, often when you get an exam back or any sort of graded assignment, you might think, oh, this was unfair. And maybe no assessment is 100% fair. There will be mistakes in it, and this will be the same for your evaluations, but no evaluation will be 100% unfair as well. Even if most of it you think might be wrong, try to take what from the evaluation you think might actually be correct and try to work on that. Because every feedback, every criticism, that is an opportunity to learn if you have the attitude of curiosity to begin with. Point number 2, and these points will go a little bit faster, but the curiosity was the number one thing according to Simon Roby, so that's why I focus on it. The second one is called freedom. And this is going to be linked to something I mentioned right at the start when I was at orientation. So when I started at Morgan Stanley, I started just before September the 11th. Then September the 11th happened, and we knew that jobs were going to be cut quite quickly, right? And indeed, there were 4 rounds of firing in the 2 years that I was there. So we thought as analysts, what we had to do is work the entire time and try to make ourselves seem indispensable by just working. And there was one day in the office where I was just quite unhappy. I think I might have been there either on the weekend or really late. I was in the chemicals group, and right next to me was the transport group. And the transport group was headed by a guy called Ben Story, who was the youngest head of any team at Morgan Stanley at that time. And he took me aside, he took me for dinner, and he offered to mentor me. And he took me for lunch, and he said, well, you know that you think that you are being diligent by just working all the time, but to me, working flat out shows insecurity, not diligence. Well, it shows me that you think that the only way that you can prove your self-worth is by just doing everything that your boss tells you to, just working all the time, rather than trying to prove yourself and prove your worth by thinking of good ideas. And that was before the time in which I told my boss, let's not do the additional compoundable company. So one of the things which came out directly out of Ben talk to me is not thinking, oh, I need to do everything that my boss tells me to do. Instead, I'm going to try to actually think creatively about these things and try to contribute by contributing ideas, not just hours and muscle. So Ben said that he actually looked down on any analysts who just accepted everything that he would throw at them, because that would suggest them insecurity, and that would also suggest that they'd be great analysts, but they'd never be good associates or never be good senior bankers. And those are the skills that you want to learn and try to acquire. So here's an analogy which I don't think I mentioned in orientation. This might seem really off, but let's just bear with me. This does have some relevance. So how, if you were in Latin America and you wanted to catch a monkey, how would you catch a monkey? So what they do is they will take a coconut, they drill a little hole in the coconut, and they pour some sweet, sticky rice into the coconut. So the monkey comes along and grabs the sticky rice. But the monkey can't get the hand out. Why? Because the hole that you've made is so small that while a palm can go in, a clenched fist cannot come out. So the hunter comes along and catches the monkey. Why? Because the monkey is trapped. But the only thing is the monkey is not trapped. Right, the monkey could choose to open the hand and get rid of the sticky rice. The monkey's trapped himself by choosing to hold on to that sticky rice. So the question is, well, what is your sticky rice? For me, that sticky rice was thinking I needed to work all the time and do everything that the boss told me to do. And this is what might have caused me just to work long hours in the office. Maybe the sticky rice was thinking, I need to stay until 10 p.m. every day, regardless of how much work I have to do because of FaceTime. When in fact, after the talk with Ben, I realized I could leave at 8 p.m. or 7 p.m. if I had no work to do. And there were no negative consequences. I realized I could tell the boss, well, maybe I don't need to do the analysis that you were suggesting. And in my first review, which was after just 6 months, and you might think, well, the first 6 months you need to get your head down and just do what people tell you. But because of Ben's talk, I didn't. And this review said, notably for a first-year analyst, Alex has the courage to speak up and express his own views, which is to be encouraged. And that says far more about Morgan Stanley than it does about me. Is that at Morgan Stanley, they recognized that they wanted junior staff who didn't just execute everything people told them to do, but were willing to express their views, and they wanted them to contribute in those ways as well. And also in terms of freedom, just to maintain and cultivate outside interests. So in my first year at Morgan Stanley, I was part of a rowing team. I used to row at university, and often I might not be able to work on the weekends because we were at a competition somewhere. The second year, I ended up training and running the London Marathon, which is something which also takes a lot of time. And those are things you might think, well, you shouldn't have time for if you're working in a bank, to tell your boss you can't work at the weekend because you're off in a rowing competition. Seems to be like a really trivial thing. But actually, this was something that, because I had a reputation for getting the work done, they knew that even though I was to spend, say, one day at the weekend away, I'd still make sure that I do the work. And I think it's very important just to maintain these outside interests and the fact that work-life balance is not a cliche, because if everything that you do is your job, then whether your job is going well or badly will determine your entire mood. Right? If your boss fails to give you recognition for something, that could crush you if your life is your job. But if you've had these other things outside it, right, and your job is not everything, that actually makes you more successful at your job rather than less, because your emotions are not entirely driven by whether you're given a good deal to work on or whether your boss gives you credit for something. Because if you view yourself as not free, then you will resent your job. Right here, with a MIM from LBS, you can go into whatever career that you want to. There are lots of employers who'd love to have somebody with your skills. So why go into something where you view yourself as not free and not able to have freedom, not just in terms of your working hours, but in terms of expressing how you'd like to do the job, and that involves things such as suggesting not to do the analysis with the 15th comparable company. Point number 3 is proactivity. And I alluded to earlier that a level 1 skill is to do a task really well and accurately when your boss gives it to you. But a high level skill is not just to do what you're told, but to proactively think about how to make your colleagues' lives easier. So as I mentioned, chemicals sat next to transport, and another guy who took me under his wing when I was a first-year analyst, there was a third-year analyst called Robert Mayhew. He's the son of David Mayhew, a legendary banker, the former chairman of Cazenove, and Robert's now a senior banker in his own right at Barclays. And this is what he told me as being his number 1 advice: think about how you can make your boss's life easier. So let me give you, again, 2 practical examples. So one was there was the head of European equity capital markets going on a flight to a business meeting, And I, obviously, as the junior dog's body, was told to be a delivery boy, basically to get the books printed and just deliver the books to him at the airport. And I could have just done that. But my best friend in the analyst class, who'd been at Morgan Stanley 1 year before me, he said, don't do that. Ask the guy, can I have 5 minutes of your time and I'm going to show you, I'm going to walk you through the book. And so I did. And so I said, well, this is what this analysis is for. This is what this page is going to do. This is the key message out of this section. And that was something which he really appreciated. And he was one of the people who ended up being with me and supporting me when I did the presentation in front of the global head of investment banking. So again, on one level, I could have seen my task being just to deliver the pitch book. And if I did that on time, and if the books were printed correctly with no typos, then I would have done my job. But not because of me, but because of my classmate, what I did, I ended up with doing more than that and actually walking him through the book, which not only sort of gave me, quotes, FaceTime with this guy, but actually made his life easier because he knew how to present the book because he knew that the goal of all of the analyses. Another thing I saw, more by eavesdropping, was I heard a managing director shout at another analyst. Why was he angry? What this managing director asked is he asked the analyst to give him a set of equity analyst reports on a company. He wanted to find out what the equity brokers were saying about the firm. So what did the guy do? He did exactly what he's told. He got the latest broker reports, stapled them all nicely, and put them on his desk. And the managing director was angry. Well, he said, well, I don't want you just to dump the articles on my desk. What I hope you would do is perhaps read the broker reports and summarize them to me and say, well, overall, it seems that analysts are concerned about the company for these reasons. And that's something which not only makes the boss's life easier, it makes your job much more interesting. Right? You're not just being a print person, but you're actually reading and discerning this. And it's something where it gives you an opportunity to learn. You learn nothing just by printing the broker reports, but you learn about the equity analyst perception of a company by just going that one step further. Now, these things don't take much time, right? So as analysts, you're working all the time, regardless of whether it's banking or a non-finance job. But it took me 5 minutes to go through the book with Frank Predictor. You could probably skim the headlines of these broker reports in 5 or 10 minutes and provide the summary. And so these don't take a lot of time, but it just takes a different attitude. And I mentioned I crowdsourced this, some of this talk from some of my friends. And so here are 3 things that people said to me, and I never told them that I was going to include this in the talk. This was as a consequence of them sending these quotes to me. So one of them is a former friend at university who's now a director at Deloitte. She said, say yes to as many requests as you can without overcommitting yourself. Right, you're still free to reject things, even if they seem dull. You will get to try a bunch of new things and get a reputation for positivity and reliability that will likely lead to you being asked to do more interesting things in the future. People who are prepared to take dull, time-consuming things off my plate and make a good job of them are the front of the queue when I have interesting jobs to give out. Another guy who was my classmate at MIT, who's now a CEO, he's founded his own firm, said, don't just do what is asked of you. Look around, ask yourself what the organization needs, and try to step up to organize what the company needs. This is the fastest way to get promoted. Another friend conveyed this from her husband, who's an investment banker, and he wrote, they do everything, they as an analyst of today, they do everything that's asked of them, but they don't show the same ambition to take on more responsibility and climb higher than analysts showed 10 years ago. 3 more points, which will go relatively faster. So number 4 is to think about the big picture. And I've alluded to some of this before. As I said, these comments are intertwined. So when you start off as an analyst, what you focus on getting the task right. So if you're in finance, this might be just in numbers. If you're consulting, this might be doing the presentations perfectly well. And so it's one thing to be able to do the quant stuff. And these are the things that might be you're raring to do because you've learnt those skills here at LBS. That's where you're going to have a natural advantage, maybe compared to other people who come straight out of undergrad and they don't have a master's as you do. But the skills that you want to develop to become an associate or VP or the equivalent jobs in other careers are the softer skills. So the ability to present in front of a client, the ability not just to do the numbers, but to see what is the punchline of the analysis. So in a presentation, there will be the charts and the numbers, but there'll often be a few sidebar comments and some sentences. And so what I tried to do when I started was to have a go at doing those sidebar comments in addition to the numbers. Now, at Morgan Stanley, there was a division of labour. Right, as analysts, you're supposed to just do the analysis, and it's the associates who should have done the sidebar. But will an associate ever complain if you've tried to make their life easier by taking first crack at the sidebar bullets? Now, maybe the first time you do it, and this happened to me, is they completely scrap what you wrote and write something different. But then you learn, right? So one thing to think about is you can just be miffed about this, but this is a bit like feedback, right? The feedback was what I initially wrote was wrong. Then I looked at what my VP or associate wrote, and I thought, well, oh, that's actually what they want. And maybe the second time you do this, maybe they keep half of what you write, and maybe by the end, you're able to write all of the qualitative bullets in addition to doing the quantitative analysis. But again, this is something which you need an attitude to do. As an analyst, right, certainly when I was in finance, you love building the most complicated model possible with so many Excel switches and macros. But this is something where, as a VP or as an MD, nobody really cares about. What you'd like to do is to look beyond that and look at the softer stuff. And this also involves networking. Now, networking is something which has a really grubby reputation. This has very negative connotations as being smarmy. This is not the case. What does networking mean at London Business School? This means meeting other classmates because you're really interested in them, and maybe meeting people outside of MIM because you're interested in the LBS community more generally. What does networking mean within a company? Meeting people outside your home desk. My boss in my first year told me that when it comes to review time, it's better to have 12 people saying that you're good than 6 people saying that you're very good. Why? Because you just got more people who will pitch for you, who will be standing in your corner. So then when I was a summer associate, I was put in the interest rate strategy desk. So that was a small team. And then what I did is I would get together with there was 3 other summer associates all on the same desk as me, all working in interest rates, just not interest rate strategy, but other parts of interest rates. Now there was another flaw in sales and trading, which was not interest rates, it was credit. And what we do is we collectively, the 4 of us, say, we're summer associates, we're working in interest rates, but we don't see any of the credit side of the business. Would you mind spending half an hour of us to have coffee? And so we did this all together, all 4 of us. So it was easier for them to say yes than if they were to email, or if we were to email them individually for 4 individual meetings. And it meant that we did get to explore other parts of the business. And therefore, when it came to the time when people were making offers, there'll be more people who will be supporting us. Now, we didn't do this in order to instrumentally get more people to pitch for us when it came to offer time. We did this because we were genuinely curious about the other parts of the business. But as a byproduct, it is good just to be generally known. And as part of this, you might want to develop other people who can mentor you. So I was mentored by this guy, Ben, who was in transport, who had nothing to do with chemicals, even though, just because they were next to me. And even now, so many years later, we were exchanging emails a few months ago when I told him that I give this advice, not actually to this talk, but to an MBA student who was mentoring him, and he told me about how hard his summer was in terms of how hard he had to work. And another former student who responded to my question about what to give in this talk, what he wrote to me is, get a mentor that has been successful and is willing to mentor you in the field you would like to pursue. This is the biggest game changer in my current career and probably the biggest reason for failure in my past one. The stereotype is that investment bankers or senior people in any job that you are in, they're really, really busy. They don't have hours for you. That might be right, but most people will have half an hour for you every month. And to ask somebody to mentor you, that's something that people actually love doing. That means that you've chosen them to be the person you'd like to guide their career. And most of the senior people I know, regardless of what career they're in, they love trying to pass on what they've learned and passing on to the next generation. That's why a lot of great LBS alums come back here and they'll give talks to current students. So this is something I'd absolutely urge you to do. And finally, it's just to savor the big picture, the purpose to your job. So when I climbed Cotopaxi, which is the highest volcano in the world, it's in Ecuador, the guide said to me, mountaineers reach the peak, but miss the point. So you can be so focused on doing what you're doing accurately that you don't realize the broader point to what you're doing. So in terms of one of the last examples, one of the goals for me was to go to Heathrow Airport and give the book to the head of equity capital markets. That was the peak. What was the point of this? It's not just to give him the book, but help him prepare for the meeting. And that's why just spending 5 minutes to go through the book with him was very helpful. And so we want to think about the big picture, the breadth, the length, the height and depth of what you are doing. So how does my analysis contribute to society? How did it contribute to the client? It was clear to me that adding the 15th comparable company would not have contributed to the client. And there will be days when your job, regardless what job it is, let's say you're marketing a product, where you're in the office until 3 AM working on a spreadsheet, and you're thinking, well, what's the point of this? But if you realize, well, this is a great new product which is going to transform customers' lives for the better, which is using the best technology, and you're thinking about the best way to get it in front of the potential customers, then there is a big social purpose to what you're doing, and that can provide you with just greater incentive and sort of great enjoyment and enthusiasm during the most difficult times. And that's linked to my penultimate point here, which is about responding. So when I addressed you at orientation, I said, never forget the excitement of getting into LBS. Because things might go wrong in your first year here, in your year here. Maybe you don't get into classes that you want to. But just be grateful that you are at one of the world's top business schools. And this is the same for whatever job that you end up going to. Like when you get the offer, you are extremely excited to be joining that firm. And then during your time there, things will go wrong. So I might be put into the chemicals department, or I might be having to do an analysis for the 10th time, and it might seem really boring. But I try to remind myself, I'm really grateful to be working at Morgan Stanley. There's so many people in the world who would love this job, and I'm working with really smart people, and I'm able to continue to learn skills that I started at university and new skills that I didn't have before. And this is really important because I talked to you in orientation about the idea of the neuroplasticity of the brain, is that our brains continue to form. I talked about this in terms of paying attention, and if we are always able to stop distractions of, say, iPhones and other things, this means that the brain is rewired and able to focus so that when you work on a problem set or you work on a cover letter, you're able to focus on that. Another thing which is scientifically proven is the idea of contentment being something being part of your brain. Why in your lives do you know happy people and unhappy people? Unhappy people are people who in every situation, they'll grumble about everything and their brain is rewired so that they will always look to the negatives of a situation. Happy people are happy people who always will look to the positives of a situation because that's a habit that they've done. And one of my favorite other books, in addition to the 7 Habits, is this book called The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, which I would also strongly recommend if you have time to do this. And so people who are always able to respond positively to any situation, they're just happy people. They're people that everybody wants to be around. So when there is a new project to be done, who is it who the managing director is going to ask? It's going to be the people who respond positively even to tasks which might seem mundane, because they see the bigger picture about this. They're contributing to, say, the marketing of a great new product. This is also about not just responding to difficulties, as in sort of bad things that you're given to you, which are not your fault, but also to failures where you've done something wrong. So one of the very first things I did when I was young is I used to play chess. I used to play for the England junior team. And I started when I was 5 years old. And when I lost a game, I would cry. I'd burst into tears. But then the longer I played, and the more games I lost, the more I realized that losing is just part of life. In most games, somebody does lose. Right? Some of the best baseball teams, they lose 40% of their games. And then there's a book called The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck says, when you find that life is difficult, then life is no longer difficult. Right? There will be so many times where you will do analyses and they won't be perfect. You'll get things wrong, but you'll just have to just recognize that this is part and parcel of a career. So there's a great TED talk by Angela Duckworth who looks at, well, what is the best predictor of future success, career and life success? Not so much talents or skills, but grit, the ability to keep the passion for the long-term goal in mind. So when I go into my athletics training on the weekend, and the coach gives a really difficult practice and beasts me, I don't like it when it's happening, but I know that this is going to be a great practice, that I'm going to be much stronger for it. I wish I could have that same attitude to a bad meeting. When I'm in a meeting and then somebody says something I disagree with, I am obviously right all the time, right? So I think that this person is clearly wrong and being completely intransigent, and that gets me angry. But instead, right, that bad meeting is an opportunity for me to develop empathy and to see something from another person's viewpoint. But often I don't think that. In that narrow meeting, I just want to get my way and get the other person to yield. Whereas this meeting is much more than me getting my way, but the opportunity for me to develop these are the skills of empathy to build character, and I just need a different attitude in those meetings, and that would allow me to learn much more. Final thing before I wrap up is ethics. And this is something I didn't originally have when I had my talk, and then I got some last-minute suggestions in. And I didn't have this because I thought, well, is this a cliche? But when the comments came in, it was quite deeper than this. And as soon as I put this, I looked up what ethics was in dictionaries, and I was going to give you a dictionary definition, but I realized that no definition was necessary. So ethical behavior is just doing the right thing, and people will know what is ethical and what is not. And then just going back to something I mentioned in my orientation speech, what I talked about was purposeful companies, companies that treat their workers well, they end up outperforming. But they didn't treat their workers well to outperform. They treated the workers well because it was the right thing to do, and they ended up outperforming as a byproduct. And then similarly, there's a lot of evidence that ethical business in the end pays off in the long run. Indeed, I've been working for the past 18 months on a project with Andy Haldane, the chief economist of the Bank of England, based on the idea that purposeful companies, which put purpose rather than profit as their heart, end up being profitable anyway. So another mentor, a guy called David Wong, who is the chief operating officer of the interest rate and currencies business at Morgan Stanley, talked about this phrase, your word is your bond. But obviously, being a finance nerd, he couldn't help but using the word bond as a pun. So he said the following: in this business, your word is your bond. If you default on your bond, then just like Latin American countries in the 1980s, you won't be coming back to the markets. And another former student, who's now product manager at Google, said the following: my biggest piece of advice for the talk is the following. One thing that I recognized early in my career is not all good business deals are good business. There's far more to a deal than the numbers. Pick your partners and learn who makes good customers and who makes good deal partners. The other aspect is many deals are different. Some are transactional, others build long-term memory and relationships, and you build a reputation in both. Billy Bean in Moneyball is an example. He never makes one-sided deals, even if it's in his small deals. And that makes him a top call for bigger deals. School taught me almost nothing about that. He didn't go to London Business School, obviously. And why is this the case? Well, this means that you want to think about deals to increase the pie for all, rather than increasing your share at the expense of other people. So one of the things in the Stephen Covey book is the idea of not just seeking win-win, which we already know, but seeking win-win or no deal. And why is that better than win-win according to Covey? This means we have the outside option to agree to disagree. We can choose to walk away from the deal unless it's going to be mutually beneficial for both parties. In my second year at Morgan Stanley, we were asked by Abbey National, which is now Santander, to pitch for the mandate to sell Porterbrook, which was their train leasing company. And in this pitch, we need to convince them why they should go with Morgan Stanley rather than Goldman Sachs or Deutsche Bank. But my boss, the guy called William Chalmers, he said in the pitch, don't go with Morgan Stanley. In fact, don't sell Porterbrook at the moment. The market is not right for you to sell it. And that's a massive sacrifice, right? Because that would forego millions of dollars of fees. But Abbey National agreed to do this. They didn't sell Porterbrook. What happened a few years later is Santander came in and made a bid for Abbey National. And knowing that they could trust William, they decided to give Morgan Stanley the entire defense mandate for this massive transaction. Now, William never turned down the Porterbrook deal thinking he would get this benefit later. He turned this down because it was the right thing to do. And this was later rewarded, even though that was never the instrumental goal. Some of you might have seen my former student Will Shue when he came in to talk about Deliveroo at the Tell series. And what Deliveroo was realizing was that while they're making a lot of money with their customers, they realized that the delivery drivers coming in was eroding the front of house experience because diners, when they're having the meal, there was often Deliveroo bikers coming into the restaurant. And so they said, we recognize that we are hurting your business as customers. So we're going to try and start something called Deliveroo Additions, which is kitchens outside of your restaurant where you can cook your food and serve your delivery customers. And notice this was not something that the customers came to Deliveroo and said, you need to do this, otherwise we're going to stop working with you. Deliveroo recognized it themselves and they proactively took some steps. So let me just wrap up now. So all of the above points in your talk can be practiced in your career, but they can also be practiced in your life as well. And really the most important thing about this is execution. So people say knowledge is power, but many people know that they should exercise and stop smoking, they don't execute. Many people know that they shouldn't keep spending, but they still might get into debt. And indeed, my brother, who's a director of a PE firm at a very young age, he thinks, well, strategy, okay, that sounds good, but really what matters, what differentiates the great businesses from the ones that fail is can they execute? And so what I encourage you to do is try to practice some of this in your lives right now. So as Gandhi once wrote, one man cannot do right in one part of life while he is occupied in doing wrong in any other departments. Life is one indivisible whole. So while I've talked to you about all of these things in terms of hitting the ground running in your career, all of these turn out to be things that one can already apply in your life. So in terms of curiosity, everything is an opportunity to learn. So it might be you're part of a committee meeting which doesn't seem to be that interesting, or you might go to a future talk or seminar which doesn't seem to be exciting you, but there'll always be something that you can learn from it. Freedom, we talked about the idea of rejecting the things that are urgent but not important in orientation. Proactivity, how to make others' lives easier, not just your boss. Maybe there's some classmates who don't yet have jobs, and you know that there's potential employers here looking for somebody of your classmate's profile. In terms of the big picture, mountaineering or any just hobby that you have, to think about the journey, not just the goal, not just to reach the peak without missing the point. The idea of responding, practicing contentment daily, which I also mentioned in orientation, having this attitude of always thinking what you can be thankful for. And the idea of ethics is to serve when no one is looking, to do things which are the right thing, even if there's no instrumental benefit. We know that in our future careers, there'll be certain things that will be evaluated, even if something will not get onto your evaluation form, that's not the reason not to do it. If we only do things, if they're going to be rewarded, then many of the great things in the world would never get done. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to address you, and thank you so much for being patient during this hour-long talk. Now, some of these things might not apply to you immediately, but hopefully there's some small snippets in what I've said which might help you to become great alumni, just like all of the other great alumni that we're proud to have here at London Business School. And I think there's a few minutes for some questions if some students have at the end.